Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us. So I'll let you take it away.
Sure, thanks, Haley. All right, so it's Elizabeth Sullivan from the Cornell Food Venture Center in freezing Geneva, New York today. And I'm going to talk about scaling your food business safely. And just sort of caveat, I'm assuming in this presentation that food product exists, that you already have a food product that you're making and you want to scale it up. So please, if you have extra questions, if you wonder what I'm talking about, chime in, put them in the Q&A, whatever it is, and off we go. So a little bit about the Food Venture Center. Our mission is to provide comprehensive technical assistance to farmers, entrepreneurs, and food companies pursuing new food products for the marketplace and to enhance food safety and promote economic development. And we've been around for about, 30 years, almost 40 now. And our director is Dr. Olga Padilla-Zakor, and she's been here and in charge since 1997. So our basic services, primarily we're a process authority service. So we have 3 process authorities on staff, myself, Dr. Olga Padilla-Zakor, and Dr. Bruno Xavier. And a process authority is a person or institution with expert knowledge, experience, and adequate facilities to make determinations about safety with regard to food processes and formulation. And it's basically the knowledge to review and approve products for safety and stability. The process authority will issue the schedule process, but also evaluate and disposition deviations, test products and equipment, and evaluate any changes. And that change part is going to be important when we're talking about scale up. The Food Venture Center also provides better process control school trainings. We do trainings in FSMA for human foods, GMPs, there's product development certification, and you can certainly contact us if you have interest in any of those things. All right, so specifically, scale up considerations. So you've got a food product and you want to scale it up. And the questions are really broad and cover everything, right? The product changes, are there processing changes, are there packaging changes? Are we suddenly subject to different regulations? Are there storage changes? And it goes on and on. So let's talk a little bit about the product considerations. So just your product right now, the product in general, the questions are, how is it going to be preserved? What equipment do you need to be able to make it? How is this going to be packaged? What are the consumer expectations around this product? How is it regulated? What kinds of ingredients are you using? And what are the storage requirements for both the ingredients and for the final product? There are some factors that affect food preservation for the product in general, and this includes the nutrients in the food, any acid in the food, which is going to lead to your pH, but we're also interested in the type of acid. If the water activity is controlled, so the free water in the product, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Any processes to eliminate or decrease the microorganisms and enzymes. Enzymes would be more of a quality consideration rather than necessarily a safety consideration. And this includes things like process temperatures, methods of processing the product, things like that. Are there functional compounds in the food? So things like chemical preservatives, antioxidants, stabilizers, and gums. What's the packaging and what are the storage temperatures? And then taking a step back even farther down, fundamentally as a process authority, but also for production to meet FSMA requirements, you're concerned with the hazards. So biological hazards, which a lot of my work deals with, mainly pathogens, but we need to be aware of the spoilage microorganisms also. Chemical hazards like pesticides, but particularly for food production, things like mycotoxins, patulin, for example, and allergens. Mislabeling for allergens is actually one of the #1 reasons for recalls. And then we're interested in physical hazards like stones, wood, plastic from the packaging container, broken glass, things like that. FDA has a free draft guidance for industry, Appendix 1, potential hazards for foods and processes. It's a good reference. It's I've got some issues with it, but it's a good way to start thinking about things. So talking about the biological hazard and the microorganisms. So we've got two main kinds when we talk about foods. Your pathogens, so these are microorganisms that produce disease or illness via direct consumption or the consumption of toxins. So this is bacteria mainly, but things like norovirus as well. Basically, a pathogen will make you sick before you know you shouldn't eat the product. That's why it's a pathogen. Spoilage microorganisms don't produce disease necessarily, but they deteriorate and spoil the food. You can see it, and people know that they shouldn't eat moldy things, for example, so they generally are not considered pathogens. But it is an economic concern, because you're going to have trouble selling spoiled food. All right, so controlling this microbe. Acids can inhibit, slow down, or even destroy some microorganisms. And the pH of the product will indicate the degree of acidity in your product. So the lower the pH, the more acidic. The pH scale is inverse. So it's kind of, you want a low pH if you're using pH to control microorganisms. You want more acid. A pH of 4.60 is the FDA dividing line between acid and low acid foods. So if the pH is below 4.60, it's an acid food, and if it's above 4.60, it's considered a low acid food by FDA. And this is because this really, really, really bad guy, Clostridium botulinum, which is a bacteria, that doesn't grow if you have a pH below 4.60. Clostridium, when it grows, it forms a toxin, and that toxin causes botulism. It's extremely strong and extremely potent. And so this is the bad guy. This is the thing that we want to avoid at all costs. And it's the reason for the FDA regulations for acidified foods and for low acid foods. So there are some naturally occurring acids, right? Citric acid, which is in tomatoes, it's in all your citrus fruits. Your malic acid, which is in apples. Tartaric acid, which is in grapes. Fumaric acid. Acetic acid is actually produced by fermentation, but that's a natural process as well. And lactic acid, which is also produced by fermentation. So moving away from acidity and pH, we have another way of controlling microorganisms, and that is through water activity, or you have this little notation here, the AW. So water activity is the amount of free water available for microbial growth and chemical reactions. And dissolved solids like salt and sugar bind to the water so that water is not free for microbial growth. So that's a lowered water activity. You lower the water activity by adding sugar and adding salt. Water activity scale runs from 0 to 1. 1 is pure water. And there is a correlation with decreased Brix. So those of you who are making jams and jellies, you may be familiar with Brix, and that's a measure of the sugar content. Sugar binds up water, so that is going to lower your water activity. The pathogen growth is controlled below 0.91 water activity, below 0.85 for absolutely all of them. So there's a bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus, and that can grow under certain conditions below 0.91. Below 0.6, there's no microbial growth. Very important to remember with water activity, you may not get death. So water activity is great at controlling growth. It's not so great at resulting in microbial death. So something that will result in death, right, is heat. So we can control microorganisms through heat, and we use heat to destroy them. So your basic pasteurization temperatures, 145 to 190 about, they destroy the vegetative cells of pathogens. So for example, we have refrigerated milk, cider, things like that. The pasteurization temperatures will give you a refrigerated product because it's only controlling pathogens. Commercial sterilization controls everything, so pathogens and spoilage bacteria. So your typical commercial sterilization temperatures are 180 to 285 Fahrenheit, and that destroys all the microorganisms, the pathogens, and the spoilage that could grow during the shelf life of the product. And it requires the temperature in there, because that's quite a range, right? That's over 100 degrees. That temperature will require depend on the pH and the water activity. And so, examples of products that are packed with commercial sterilization would include canned vegetables, canned fruit, aseptic coconut water, shelf-stable beverages. A lot of barbecue sauces are subject to commercial sterilization. Anything that's shelf-stable, basically. We can also use cold to control microorganisms. Cold generally doesn't destroy them, but it does control their growth. So refrigeration is used to extend the shelf life because low temperatures slow down growth of microorganisms. So spoilage is not going to grow so fast. Microbial shelf life studies are needed oftentimes to prove shelf life. Some pathogens like Listeria, Clostridium perfringens, they can grow anyway, even under refrigeration. So we have to be aware of that. And refrigeration can also slow acidification and microbial death. So you want to be aware of that as well. Freezing just stops everything from growing. Totally stops it, but it may not kill it. All right. Controlling microorganisms, another thing to think about is that the ingredients themselves can control your microorganisms. Some of the ingredients have antimicrobial properties, but those inherent properties depend very much on the ingredient quality and type. So it's sort of a nice to have, but it's not something to rely on. We have source traits. A lot of your ingredients have traits that lead to whether or not they're going to be good at controlling the microorganisms. And many of these ingredients, your acids, will have particular traits. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are more concentrated than others. So you can get a vinegar with 5% acetic acid. You can get a vinegar with 12% acetic acid. You can get a lime juice. Fresh lime juice is about 2.5% citric acid. Lime juice concentrate may be 30% citric acid. Those are going to have very different effects on pH, and they're going to have very different effects on the microorganisms. So this is something to think about when we're involved in scale up and we're thinking about the ingredients used in the larger batch sizes. Your ingredients may require sanitation in order to control the microorganisms. And this is the case a lot of times with dried products, which are using agricultural produce in particular. You've got to sanitize them before you dry them because you can't always rely on the drying to provide the heat treatment needed to kill them. So we need to get rid of it in other ways. If you're scaling that up, you want to make sure your sanitation regime is good enough to handle the larger load. Some of your ingredients may control microorganisms because they're chemical preservatives. So these are compounds that are used to inhibit the growth of microorganisms. They're normally used in combination with other preservation techniques to extend shelf life. So you might use a chemical preservative plus acid, for example, or chemical preservative plus all dry ingredients, or chemical preservative plus UV pasteurization to extend your refrigerated shelf life. Some examples, your typical ones would be sodium benzoate, potassium sorbate, but we're also talking about like the sulfites, the nitrates, and then natural antimicrobials, natural in quotes, MicroGuard, natamycin, which is used mainly for mold control, and niacin, which controls Clostridia, for example. There are other ones as well. Any of your cultured dextrose. So MicroGuard, you can label it as cultured dextrose. It's not the only one. It's not the only cultured dextrose. And the usage is very often regulated by law. And so this is something that you have to think about also when you're talking about scale up, because those chemical preservatives, as you're scaling up your product, they may become less effective, but you may not be allowed to increase them. All right. So just to reiterate, when you're doing scale up and you're looking at microbial control, does the formulation need to be changed? Because of quality considerations, right? We want to change the formulation because maybe the taste isn't what we want in the scaled up version. But does that actually impact the pH? Does that impact the type of acidity? Are we changing ingredient? Are we changing from fresh lime juice to lime juice concentrate, or from fresh tomatoes to tomato paste? And then what's the effect on the amount of ingredient? What's the effect on the acidity? What's the effect on the pH? Do we have storage facilities for the increased amount of product or for that final product? Can we store it? How does the equipment affect the critical parameters like water activity? A lot of times water activity is influenced by salt and sugar, but is also influenced by evaporation. So if you're evaporating off that water, you're decreasing the free water that's available. How does the equipment size affect that? And the ingredient type changes. Are there ramifications? I talked about, fresh lime juice versus lime juice concentrate, but are we moving between fresh garlic and dry garlic? Are we moving to individually quick frozen herbs? Is there a difference in terms of microbial load there? So this is just a little picture of the typical small scale production of the product. We're going to talk about processing options now, and this is something that very, very often happens when you're scaling up. The processing itself changes. So typical hot fill hold processing would be you heat the batch in the kettle, you cook it to a particular temperature, then you fill the product hot and you close it, you invert and hold for a certain amount of time, and then you can force cool it, or you can just continue to air cool it. Then we have the in-bottle sterilization, which is more your boiling water bath approach to your pickles, things like that. So you fill hot or cold and you close the container. So maybe if you're making vinegar brine pickles, you fill the solids into the jar cold, and then you pour hot brine over them, close it, and then you process in a boiling water bath for a certain amount of time. Then you take it out of the boiling water bath and you cool it down. All right. Why is this not working? There we go. Okay. So some cook, hold, hot fill considerations when you're scaling up. The cook can affect the quality, and the cooking effects can differ with the equipment that you're using. So if you move from stovetop production to a bigger batch size in something called a steam kettle, that's the way the steam kettle heats is different from the way that the product in a pot on your stove heats. So this stove, the heating is all from the bottom. The steam kettle is often, it's a big kettle. They're, anything from 5 to 250 gallons or bigger. And there's a double wall. So you have the outside wall and then you have the interior wall. And between those two walls, steam runs through it. And that steam is the source of heat, and that comes up and around the product. So that is a much higher heat, very fast, and it is going to affect the way that that product cooks. Other considerations, some products are too thick to hot fill, practically speaking. So it may be you may be able to pour it at small scale into a jar with a ladle. It may be too thick to go through the filler at a co-packer. Or it may be something that's just taking the co-packer too long to fill all the jars, even if they're doing it with a ladle. They may not be willing to give it the time that's needed. That being said, the process is often easy to scale up. If you're addressing these considerations, the process is usually easy to scale up. And many, many co-packers can do this sort of cook, hold, hot fill process. If you're doing a boiling water bath, this can be really useful for products with big chunks, because if you try to hot fill them, it's going to splash all over the place. The ratio of chunks to liquid can be very hard to control if you're hot filling. So it can be really a good way to go for those products, and easier to control consistently from small scale to large scale. But as you scale up, you may require additional testing to establish the amount of time in the boiling water bath, or your co-packer may not have a boiling water bath. They may have a water bath at a different temperature, lower temperature, for example, or they may have a piece of equipment that's like a heat tunnel, right? It's and that's usually steam or hot water that's cascading down on top of the jars. And that's going to require something called heat penetration testing to determine the way the heat flows, the way the product heats up, and how long that needs to happen. Fewer co-packers can do this. You've got to be very careful about asking for it and talking with them about what they are able to do.
Elizabeth, I had a
Yes.
question from somebody. So they're wondering, how do we know, I guess as a producer, how do we know we've reached a big enough operation to make this applicable?
How do we know if what?
If we've reached like a big enough operation, I guess like thinking about the scale, like, how would you quantify? I think maybe the question is just about processes, but
yeah.
How big is big enough when you need to start thinking about these things?
Yes, and to give you a complete non-answer, that really depends on how much you think you could sell. So when I'm talking about scale up in general, what I'm talking about is moving from a batch that you can make in your own production facility, like whether that's a commercial kitchen attached to your farm or attached to your house sometimes, or you're using a small scale shared use kitchen, but you're making it yourself in a stock pot on a stove, that kind of size production. Usually you can take that up a bit. It usually involves making multiple batches because your cooking pot is only so big. You can only jam so much of it into a single cooking pot at a time. True scale up would be actually moving to a larger batch size. So you're looking at moving to a contract packer or moving to a facility that has larger batch size equipment to use. So maybe a 50-gallon steam kettle, something like that. And so you're making 50 gallons of barbecue sauce at a time rather than 5. And that your decision about whether to scale up or not is really going to depend on it's a business decision fundamentally. there's a lot of things to think about. And I'm only going to talk about some of them, but, and I'm not a business person. I'm a food safety person. So there's a whole lot of things that go into the business aspect of whether or not you determine that scale up is something you want to do.
So it seems like it's both like capacity and business, like what your business
Yes,
is and also what you
absolutely.
can handle as
Yeah.
the person who's making it. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, and it's around Robin, right?
Yeah.
It's constantly, you can make yourself crazy thinking about this.
Okay. Thanks for
Yeah.
answering. I'll let you continue.
So the third processing option for a shelf-stable product would be a cold or ambient fill type of process. And this is used mainly for things like salad dressings. Very often it's used for some honey-based products. And it's very often used if you've got a refrigerated product. So you don't need heat, but then what are your other ways for controlling your microorganisms? Maybe it's water activity. So for the honey-based products, a lot of times that's water activity control. It's the sugars binding up all the water. But then you need to think about the ingredients you're adding to that honey. You can't add fresh stuff because that's going to add water. So you might add dry things. And then what sort of micro is coming in that way? When you scale up, are you dealing with, there are pH or water activity constraints for cold fill. So when you scale up, you need to make sure that your product is still meeting those constraints. You need to make sure that your organic acids or your sugar percentage or the same type of sugar is being used so that your pH, your water activity are being maintained. When you're thinking about scale up, very often your ingredients change, because if you're scaling up, maybe you can't afford local fresh produce anymore. You need to have a more consistent source of produce. And so you may find yourself moving to frozen produce. You may find yourself needing to move to a combination of dry produce and frozen produce. And then all of those things, is that going back affecting your pH? Is that affecting your water activity? What's your processing like? Does your mixing equipment need to change in size and capacity? Are you doing dehydrating or freeze drying? Are there temperature abuse concerns with the ingredients themselves? Again, do we need to sanitize those ingredients? Is that practical? Can you sanitize that, enough ingredient to scale up production? And then your chemical preservatives. In ambient filled products, you almost always have chemical preservatives to control spoilage. If you're using particularly your more natural preservatives, is the effect the same in the scaled up version as it was in your previous version? All right. So just to touch on some other processing options, you've got drying or dehydration. Microbial death for drying and dehydration, it requires heat and a humid air. Microorganisms die faster in humid air. And you can think about this. If you stick your hand in the oven when you're pulling out cookies, your hand can take that temperature, that 350, whatever, for some time. It's not a lot of time, but it's some time. And your hand can stand it without burning. That's dry heat. You cannot put your hand in boiling water for any time. That's humid heat, right? That will scald you. It's very harmful. So the same thing happens with microbes. If you're doing meat jerky, there are heat and humidity requirements because you're getting your kill step with that dehydration. For other things, if you're doing dried produce, most dehydrators don't control the heat well enough, or the heat's not high enough to lead to pathogen death. So we have to control microorganisms with other means. And this is things like sanitation and getting ingredients verified pathogen free if you're getting them from a supplier. Your equipment may limit your ability to scale up. So this is the case for a sauce. Maybe you have a stock pot to a steam kettle, and there are considerations, but those pieces of equipment exist. The dehydrator, that exists, but it may be way too expensive to move up to a larger dehydration unit. So scale up may limit your ability, may be limited by the equipment available. The other issue with scale up is that there are not very many co-packers to do dehydrated products. Most of the dehydration commercially is done at huge facilities, and it's not very amenable for small scale processors. Freeze drying, so it's a subset of your drying, right? But freeze drying, the important thing to know here that I'm just going to add in because this is really not understood, and we have people selling freeze dryers that don't understand this. So freeze drying doesn't kill anything. You're not, the microbiologists, they actually freeze dry their cultures in order to preserve them long term. So they'll rehydrate them if they want active microbes. So freeze drying doesn't kill anything. It is not a kill step. So you need other hurdles to control the microorganisms. You need, again, sanitation. You need verified pathogen-free ingredients. If the food is low acid, you've got to have temperature control before the freeze drying. So it's usually you have to freeze those produce pieces or whatever it is before you freeze dry it. Again, just like with dehydration, the equipment may limit your ability to scale up. And there are really not many co-packers that can do freeze drying.
There's an interesting question that's come up
Yeah.
about mushrooms.
Yes.
Because this person is saying that they work with often dehydrating mushrooms, and usually, mushrooms are not supposed to get wet. So do you have any requirements for pre-sanitizing or like other options for special case produce that like can't have maybe a sanitation step or a wet step?
So I'm going to spin this around a little bit. If you are
Okay.
doing this product as a ready to eat product intended for people to eat right out of the bag, you're going to have to sanitize. Quite frankly, the quality of the mushroom is going to degrade a little bit in drying anyway. And sanitation it's going to have to happen. And water sanitation is absolutely the easiest way to go. There are sanitizers out there that are peracetic acid or hydrogen peroxide based. Those are also, you're going to end up doing a post sanitizer rinse. It's going to be water. So if it's ready to eat, you're going to have to sanitize it. If you're dehydrating to use the product as, intended for rehydration and use in soups, for example, where the soup cooking is actually going to sanitize it. It's a hurdle technology issue. Again, you are going to have to control your good manufacturing practices to control the microorganisms that are on those mushrooms in the first place. So things like substrate sanitation, there are various ways of doing that. It's different for button mushrooms versus shiitake mushrooms, which are, grown on logs. It depends a lot on the type of product.
What about testing beforehand? Is that something producers can do? Like, testing for free pathogens or just keeping the
Testing.
uh-huh.
Testing. So testing is great in terms of telling you that sample doesn't have pathogens. It doesn't necessarily tell you that your entire batch doesn't have pathogens. It's a good confirmation that your sanitation is working, but I wouldn't rely on it as proof that your sanitation is working or that anything yet that you're doing, your GMPs are working. The big guys, like McCormick, for example, they're generally treating their products, the spices or, mushrooms or what have you. They have more options available to them just because the equipment they can afford the equipment. So things like ethylene oxide, you know, they may spray with a gas. Radiation, you know, again, that radiation is the equipment to irradiate products is pretty expensive and it's very regulated. So for small scale production, sanitizers are really the only way to go. Sanitizers with I'm sorry, looking just at the chat here. I have it up on my screen. It's popping up at me. The sanitizers with acetic acid. It's not acetic acid. It's hydrogen peroxide, or it may be called peracetic, PER, acetic acid, or peroxyacetic acid. That's your Sanidate is one of those. Sorox is one of those. Tsunami is another one. And those would all, they have very specific information on concentrations, and almost always they require a potable water rinse afterwards to get rid of the sanitizing agent. Human health concerns about sanitizer that's been dehydrated. The dehydration doesn't actually do a whole lot for the sanitizer. You want to rinse that sanitizer off almost always. So if you rinse it off, that's the best way to be sure that no human is consuming it, because it's gone.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Sure. All right, so one other processing method that's being used, a lot of producers are doing this. There's been increased interest in this, is fermentations. So the use of fermentation, it's used to reduce the pH of low acid foods to below 4.60, to below the Clostridium botulinum threshold. So we have very traditional lactic acid fermentations, which would include, you know, your pickles, like sour dills, sour kosher dills, things like that. They're almost always fermented. Sauerkraut, kimchi, a lot of sausages are actually fermented. Yogurts and cheeses are fermented. So they're using a culture that uses lactic acid bacteria. Those bacteria consume the starches, the carbohydrates, and they produce lactic acid as a result, and that lactic acid drops your pH. Then we have the alcohol, then acid fermentations. And so things like kombucha, vinegar, kvass, these products start out with an alcoholic fermentation. So you have yeast fermentation, yeast consuming the sugars and producing alcohol. And then you have an acid, usually Acetobacter, coming in and eating the alcohol, and they produce acid. It's usually acetic acid. And the issue with this is if it's going to be a food, you have to make sure that final product ABV is less than 0.5%. So it's less than 0.5% alcohol. Otherwise, it's not considered a food by federal regulations. You'd be under the state liquor authority or under the TTB, depending on the size of your business. Fermentations will result in refrigerated final products, generally speaking, unless you're heat treating. And they're routinely inspected by the state. It's not something that's inspected by FDA, but it is usually inspected by the state. In terms of scale up, it's unusual to find a co-packer that has the storage capacity to do a fermentation at large scale. So fermentation scale up is generally a function of making sure that you've got enough space and enough temperature control to move from like your big 5-gallon bucket to maybe multiple 5-gallon buckets or a 20-gallon container, something like that. There are some other non-thermal processing options. The two most common ones would be high pressure processing. And the usual treatment is about 85,000 PSI for about 2 to 3 minutes. If you've got an acid pH, sometimes high pressure processing is used for pHs above 4.6. And I apologize, that slide is wrong. It's not 1.5 minutes, it's 3 or more minutes for pHs above 4.6. And in reality, low acid products almost never work for pathogen control under high pressure processing. It works on guacamole, luncheon meats, juices, seafood. A lot of times these products might be using HPP to control spoilage microorganisms, but things like juices, they may be controlling pathogens as well. Works best for microbial reduction when you have a pH lower than 4.6 and a water activity higher than 0.93. And Shelby, absolutely yes. With dehydration, you would rinse, sanitize, rinse your produce, get your produce totally clean and sanitized, and then dehydrate. And I would say this would go actually, this is actually something that happens when people are dehydrating flowers also. So some of your herbs and floral things as well, they're sanitizing those products and then they're dehydrating. All right, so the next one, in addition to high pressure processing, you may have heard of ultraviolet light processing, and it's very, very common for apple cider and for juices. Basically, the fluid passes by UV light emitting bulbs, and the efficacy of this treatment depends on the cloudiness of the fluid. So it works really well for cider, apple cider. Doesn't work so well for cucumber juice, actually, because the particulates that are making the cloudiness in cucumber juice are large enough that the microorganisms can hide behind them and they don't get hit by the UV rays, and so they don't get destroyed. Both of these processing options yield a refrigerated product, and the cost may be quite high. And HPP is really not as easy to scale. You actually have to usually be at quite a high scale anyway in the very first place to make the cost worth it. UV light processing, those machines are, you can get machines that are quite small, you can get machines that are quite large. And so it's really a function of how much product you can pass through the machine in a given amount of time. All right. So back to dehydration. Lower temp will compensate for high temps to a certain degree. It doesn't always. If you get it to a temperature of really below 160, it's not going to compensate anymore. You're not going to kill the pathogens. So, you know, sous vide is a completely different thing. So sous vide is, again, talking about that humidity, sous vide is a humid process. Dehydration is not. So it's really, it's a different, entirely different equation. And yes, UV just works for fluids. Okay, so I'm going to run through storage options for the final product, just to sort of talk about them again, get it in our heads, because this is something to think about when you're doing scale up. So if you've got a shelf stable final product anyway, then this final product storage may not be such an issue for you for scale up, because you don't require refrigeration or freezing. You can find shelf space in a store very easily. It's also easy to find warehouse space. There's loads of products that are processed this way. And it's suitable for your online ordering, for farmers markets, for craft fairs. So your outlets for selling all that product that you now have because you've scaled up, the ways you can sell that product are really, it's sort of the sky's the limit. If you've got a refrigerated final product, it's hard to get it on grocery store shelves in the first place. It's usually got a short shelf life. And so when you're scaling up, if you've got a short shelf life, then you better make sure that that scaled up product, if you've got more product that needs to be sold within 7 days or 14 days, you've got to make sure you can actually do that. It becomes critical to do that because you can't store it. It does allow small scale processors to work with low acid foods like soups, non-fruit or vegetable based beverages, smoked meats, for example. But you think about, you've got cooling requirements for that microbial control. We're controlling that with refrigeration. And so that cooling, this is right out of the FDA food code, which is free online if you care. This is in chapter 3. The cooling regime, it's 135 Fahrenheit to 70 Fahrenheit within 2 hours, and then further to 41 within a total of 6 hours. Doesn't sound that bad, but if you're dealing with scale up and you're dealing with a lot more product, do you have the capacity to cool it and meet those requirements? Can you cool it from 135 to 70 in 2 hours? Do you have the refrigerated space to cool it to 41? And these become questions. Okay, and then say you've got a frozen final product. This is really considered low risk because you don't have any growth below 32 Fahrenheit. So you can extend the shelf life to months. If your packaging is good, you can extend it to years. You can use it for any type of food. You can freeze anything pretty much if you don't care about quality. But it's really tough to get retail space. And there is a really high energy cost for the retail space and also for the storage. So is your scale up resulting in a freezer that's so stuffed that it's not working anymore? Do you find yourself faced with a cost of having to buy another freezer unit and then pay for the electricity to run that freezer unit? And then the packaging is really important to protect quality. Can you afford more packaging to go with your more products? So scale up considerations, are there formula considerations? What are they going to do? Product quality, how is that going to be impacted? Does the product still meet the critical parameters? pH, water activity, can you still heat it? Is the heating done the same way? Are you finding issues because the container that you're using to heat the product doesn't have the same stirring capacity, for example? And so the larger scale is burning onto that kettle. Practicality, can you process that much product? Can you store that much product? What are the ramifications of doing that? Are you actually working yourself to the bone so much that you're forgetting to do things, that it's becoming, the processing itself is becoming an issue? And then the biggest thing with scale up is you want to make sure to try it. So anytime you scale up, you want to try it. This is sort of happens just if you're scaling from like your 5-gallon stock pot, you bought a bigger stock pot on your stove and you're making a double batch, you're going to try it anyway. But if you move to a different facility or you move from making it yourself to using a co-packer, try the product. Make sure that it works on the equipment the same way. Make sure that the product that you're getting out is the product that you want. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about regulation because this actually has some things happen when you scale up. Some things just happen anyway. Everybody has to do food facility registration with FDA. This is Form 3537. It's online. It's not that bad. It's enormous. It's something, if you print it out, it's like 15 pages. it's really not that bad. They just give you every option known to man, to check off what you do. If you are making a USDA product, like a beef jerky, like dried fermented sausages, generally speaking, they know who you are anyway, and so there may not be the required, you may not be required to register your facility. You usually have to do USDA inspections and apply for a sticker and all of that good stuff, so they may know where you are anyway. And this is for bioterrorism reasons, really. FDA wants to know where the food facilities are, so they know where the risks are. There are labeling requirements for both FDA and USDA products, and for food products in general. And then your licensing is going to be, generally speaking, under state and local requirements. And then there are thresholds. So these are the things that you would potentially fall under as you scale up your business. And it's usually scaling it up a lot. So something like going to $1 million worth of profit, something like that. So, but those are thresholds. They exist for FSMA compliance and for nutrition labeling. If you're using a co-packer because you've scaled up enough, that regulation may change, and it may be the co-packer that needs to meet the regulation and not you. So it's something to be aware of. Those regulations, again, they're product dependent. So FDA is really concerned with shelf stable, low acid, acidified, and water activity controlled foods. Water activity is above 0.85. This is in the regulations. If you are curious, you can go to 21 CFR 113. Those are the low acid canned food regs. And 21 CFR 114 is the acidified food regulations. If you're curious about it. The USDA, technically, food becomes a USDA food if it's more than 2% cooked or more than 3% raw meat. So this usually comes into play when we're doing something like pasta sauce with meat in it. If you scale up and suddenly it becomes more important to use raw meat, and your raw meat percentage goes up above 3% in your scale up because your formulation is changing a bit, suddenly it's a USDA product and you're under slightly different regulations. Refrigerated, frozen, and perishable products are usually under state or local agencies. It might be called something like the Department of Agriculture, Public Health, something like that. And the jurisdiction of those agencies is usually dependent on the location. So even in New York, right, the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets regulates a lot of these things, unless you're in New York City, in which case jurisdiction tends to be under public health. Dietary supplements are regulated under 21 CFR 111, and they are not considered foods. And this is really important to know because a lot of small scale processors, in order to market their foods, are touting the nutrition benefits or the health benefits. And you have to be really careful about your claims, because if you're making claims on your label that it's going to improve your immune system or foster low sodium content or something like that, suddenly it may be a dietary supplement, and those are under totally different regulations. And I would do everything in your power, honestly, as a small scale processor, to avoid those dietary supplement regulations. Market it as a food, if at all possible. Cannabis containing products are regulated by state. A lot of the CBD products, those are legal federally, but the states seem to have differing ideas about whether those CBD products are allowed in foods. This gets into the dietary supplement issue, but it also gets into whether or not the food is considered generally recognized as safe. It gets into labeling requirements, And so I would absolutely interact with your state department on that. THC is absolutely a state by state item. Please don't sell across state lines. You're going to get into regulatory issues. And whether those THC containing products, whether that's allowed in beverages, whether it's allowed in foods, that's another gray area that states are trying to figure out. FDA labeling requirements are in 21 CFR 101. In very, very important ingredient declaration and allergens. Allergens are a chemical hazard, and your percent juice in juice drinks. 21 CFR 101 regulates everything. It regulates text size. It regulates the size of those, the box outline for nutrition facts and things like that. For USDA labeling, it's in 9 CFR 317 or 9 CFR 381, and it requires label review and approval through USDA. Required items for labeling, product name, the usual or common name, the net weight statement in both standard and metric, the ingredient list, descending order by weight, name and address of manufacturer, packer, or distributor, nutrition facts, which is dependent on the size of your business. That's one of those thresholds to be aware of when you scale up. It also depends on the claims you're making. If you're making a nutrition claim, you have to have nutrition labeling regardless of the size of your business. The percent juice again in your beverages that purport to contain juice, allergen labeling, your inspection legend and establishment number if you're USDA, and your handling statement if you're doing USDA products or if you're doing refrigerated or frozen products. And both FDA and USDA have those labeling guidance for free online. And I have a lot more experience with the FDA one. It is like 200 pages long, but it is also quite good. So very, very readable, fairly easy to find things. And I would suggest going out online and grabbing that. Nutrition facts information. So you can do this a couple of ways. You can go through somebody who has expertise in nutrition labeling. And there is a list of folks on our website that we know about that offer nutrition analysis. It's also, I would start with a FDA food labeling guide that has a lot of information on doing nutrition facts. Scale up final thoughts. Your mix-ups happen with change. And so you want to review absolutely everything when you're scaling up. And that's just my contact information. I'll leave that on the screen.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I do wish there was a place like the Food Venture Center in every state. I know that it's different for everybody tuning in, but we really appreciate you sharing those resources. And is it possible to share these slides with folks?
Yeah, I'll send you, Haley, can I send you a PDF and then?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah,
sure.
I'd love to share these with anybody who's watching and attending. But yeah, thank you so much. I wish we had a little bit more time for questions, but scaling up is one of those things that you don't really think about when you're a consumer that much, but as a producer, it seems like there's quite a few steps to go through. Always with food safety, it's always a consideration. There's always a it depends scenario. So thanks for fielding some questions from the audience.
Sure.
And if there's anybody in the chat that has any last minute questions, feel free to type that out now. Otherwise, we will wrap up here. But is there anything upcoming, Elizabeth, that you want to plug in for Cornell or anything else you want to leave the audience with today?
So if you need Better Process Control School, we do that fairly regularly virtually. You can find a link on our website. If you've got any questions, feel free to email us. We're located in New York State, but we deal with questions from throughout the US and internationally. So just ask.
Awesome. I love that. Yep. Always ask if you're not sure what's going on. So I don't see any more questions, but if you have any more, here is her contact information. You can reach out that way. We'll also post this on our YouTube and our website at National Farmers Union. And you can also reach out to me if you have any questions, but we'll finish our conversation here today since we went a little bit over. Thank you so much again, Elizabeth. Really appreciate having you here and just talking through all the considerations.
Sure.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I'll go ahead and stop this recording.